on your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers, and kidnappers thank you, you're on the wrong side of justice. You're on the wrong side of humanity. And you're on the wrong side of history.
But first, I've invited Natasha Hausdorff, the barrister who specialises in international law, also the legal director of the UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, to reflect on events. Natasha, I don't think criticism, I should say, of Netanyahu and his government is unjustified. I'm going to keep on saying that. But are the leaders of Canada, Britain and France, and is their criticism of Israel really emboldening Hamas and putting Jews around the world in mortal danger?
Absolutely. I think it's elementary. And I would draw a distinction here. The brutal murder on the streets of DC, or execution, perhaps more properly termed, it is not emanating from criticism of the Israeli government. It is emanating from the falsehoods, the blood libels that have been propagated. And that, unfortunately, has been at the core of so many of these statements from leaders of so-called allies of the State of Israel. I'm afraid to say, including that statement from the UK, France and Canada, which was predicated on this abject falsehood of starvation in Gaza. Similar to, the notion that Israel is starving children. You only have to look at the facts of the aid that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip, the aid levels that exist there still since the ceasefire, and also the fact that each of these past predictions of famine and starvation in Gaza have been proven to be entirely false. The notion that people would still be believing these sorts of falsehoods against the Jewish state is frankly deeply, deeply concerning. But I think reminiscent of the fact that anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred, and it's here in its present form. And these ancient blood libels of Jews killing Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual are here in a modern form.
And we heard something quite similar to that, obviously not a medieval blood libel of that nature, but when you saw a highly respected, high up in the UN, Tom Fletcher, actually saying that 13,000 babies would die within 48 hours, which was repeated past him by RMPs on the floor of the House of Commons. It was a lie, of course, that went around the world before the truth got its boots on. And do you regard that as one of the aspects of the wild incitement that could have led to what happened in DC?
I think he actually said 14,000, but who's quibbling over these numbers?
Yeah,
but the point is that the numbers themselves are so ludicrous, and yet the media and politicians repeated them. They are so apparently willing to believe even something that is demonstrably, preposterously false. And could not possibly be reasoned through any logic. And yet there is this willingness to believe it. And absolutely, it is part and parcel, but it's not one comment like that. It is the last 18, 19 nearly months of relentless propaganda where, Free Palestine has been used as cover, essentially, for a battle cry of a death cult. The Palestinian terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October announced a similar objective. And this notion that people have been able to march in the streets of London week after week. What does Free Palestine mean? Freeing that land of Jews. We've already had the ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria by Jordan between 1949 and 1967. We've had the ethnic cleansing also of Gaza, of Jews, in 2005 with Israel's withdrawal. We've had the ethnic cleansing of parts of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, which are Palestinian-controlled areas A and B. They're calling for the ethnic cleansing of the rest of it. So we shouldn't be surprised in any way, not by the acts that it motivates, including that brutal execution in DC, but also not by the response to it on social media, which has sought to celebrate and justify and call for more of it. And this should serve as a wake-up call.
And lastly, Natasha Hausdorff, those listening will be thinking and screaming sometimes at the radio, because this is a uniquely divisive topic. What about, you say figures don't matter, but we know tens of thousands have died in Gaza.
Oh, no, figures do matter.
We do, but what you're saying is that we don't know the exact figures, but we know a large number of women and children have died in Gaza, and many more could be under the rubble. We know that many children, we don't know how many, are hungry, and that there has not been aid into Gaza for whatever reason for the last 2 months. What would you say to those who say it's not the criticism of the war that is leading to anti-Semitism and violent anti-Semitism across the world? It is the war itself.
To be able to answer that, I need to unpack the false premises which underlie the question. So I hope you'll allow me a moment to do that. The notion that children are going hungry in Gaza is part and parcel of the blood libel, unfortunately. What has been put out to substantiate that are supposedly photographs of starving children, which have to a point been identified as very ill children who are malnourished because of their very serious medical conditions.
We've heard medics in hospitals saying that day after day they treat very hungry, malnourished children.
I've also heard medics accusing Israel of using drones to shoot Palestinian kids, which is demonstrably false. So let's take every aspect of that testimony, perhaps with a pinch of salt. May I just come back to these photographs of children, because it's extraordinary to me that people who have looked at this and drawn their own conclusions have not sought to question the fact that the mothers pictured alongside these children are perfectly well fed. Now, Rachel, I've never met a mother who would eat before her starving child. I would that people step back and use a bit of critical thinking when it comes to these issues that are being raised, including with respect to the casualty figures, which was the other premise of this question, which I appreciate the opportunity to address, because throughout this conflict, the Hamas casualty figures have been repeated ad nauseum, despite the fact that they have been demonstrated to be fabricated. They, of course, don't distinguish between civilians and combatants. They do not tell us how these people have died. We know Hamas are shooting their own civilians, and we know that many civilians also died as a result of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets that fell short in the Gaza Strip. Why? Because those missiles do not apply a proportionality analysis. When they fall in the Gaza Strip, they kill indiscriminately, as opposed to Israel's conduct in the Gaza Strip. And this is where I think numbers are really important, because even looking at Hamas casualty figures, the consistent analysis of the proportion, the ratio of civilians to combatants, and let me caveat that this is something that military professionals and military lawyers have to look at, but it is grotesque to think about human life in this context, to think about casualty ratios. Nevertheless, it's important to put this into perspective and to put the extraordinary measures that Israel is taking to prevent civilian casualties in the Gaza Strip into perspective, because 1-to-1 or 1.5-to-1 in terms of civilians to combatants, which has consistently been the estimated ratio across this war, is unprecedented in the history of armed conflict. When you look at the UN global average of 9-to-1, or even US numbers in Iraq and Afghanistan of 5-to-1 and 3-to-1. So with that context, I would say, in answer to your question, that it is not the conduct, but it is the lies about this war that are fueling this intense anti-Semitism spike.
Thank you very much for that, Natasha Hausdorff, who is a barrister specialising in international law.